Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Shorts episode number 14, Flora Butters. Flora was known by several names. It was a bit of a minefield, but with the assistance of Flora's great-granddaughter Tracie Brown, I'm able to tell the story of Flora. Flora Lavinia Butters was born on the 8th of January 1891 at Green Ponds near Kempton in Tasmania to Robert Butters, a bricklayer and later a wool classer, and Martha Ann Reeve. She was the second born of 7 children. Flora's father was placed into the Queen's Orphan School when he was 5. His father's whereabouts were unknown, and his mother's whereabouts were also unknown. She'd just been released from the Cascades factory after a 12-month sentence. Robert Butters married Martha Reeve in Franklin, Tasmania on the 20th of June 1887 when he was 31 and Martha was 25. Robert passed away in March 1915 and Martha then married John Harper in April 1915. She died in 1950. Flora placed a death notice in the paper for her mother, Harper Nee Butters, in loving memory of our darling mother and our dear grandmother who passed away at Hobart on the 10th of September 1950. Inserted by your loving daughter Flo, son-in-law Fred, and grandchildren Bill and John of Warrenbane, Victoria. She also put a memoriam in for her mother, Harper Nee Butters, the dearly beloved mother of Flo Munro of Melbourne, also dear grandma of William, loved by all and sadly missed, late of Kempton, inserted by your loving daughter Flo. At the age of 17, Flora first got herself into a little trouble. In the Hobart Mercury, yesterday before the police magistrate, Flora Butters was remanded on a charge of vagrancy. Flora married Richard Donald Collingwood on the 30th of December 1909 in Tasmania when she was 18 and he was 34. Their marriage was placed in the paper, Collingwood Butters. On the 30th of December 1909, Richard Collingwood, son of Richard and Evelyn Collingwood, late of California, USA, now of Hobart, to Florence Lavinia Butters, daughter of Robert and Martha Butters of Kempton in Hobart. Richard was a minor at the time of their marriage and they lived at Kempton in Tasmania. It didn't take long for things not to end well, as on the 20th of January 1911 in the Hobart Mercury. To tradespeople and others, take notice that I, the undersigned, will not be responsible for any deaths contracted by my wife, Flora Lavinia Collingwood, Nee Butters of Kempton, from this date. R.D. Collingwood. They divorced in that same year. In the divorce proceedings, Richard stated that he was a cook, and he said that in the months of November or December 1910 and in the month of January 1911, the said Flora Lavinia Collingwood committed adultery with one Sanford Turner at Lawrenny near Hamilton in the state of Tasmania. Flora then married John Edward Frank Williamson on the 18th of October 1917 in Moona, Tasmania, under the name Florence Butters. She stated that she'd never been married and was 22 years old. She was in fact 26. Edward was 35 and a miner and then a woodcutter. Florence and Edward lived in Tasmania in 1919 and 1922. In 1924, Flora began a relationship with David Jack Poor, who was also known as John David Hobbs. He was 4 years younger than Flora and born in Redfern, New South Wales. David was married. He'd married Kathleen Andrew in 1915 and had 4 children with her in Melbourne. They all went by the surname Hobbs Poor hyphenated. Florence and John David Poor were allegedly married in Tasmania in 1924. However, there's no marriage certificate to validate this. David John Poor's father owned a furniture company in Sydney and named it John Hobbs Furniture, as John Poor Furniture was his father's company in England, and he didn't want there to be any confusion between the two. John Hobbs was apparently an English cricketer at the time, so this is where part of the surname Hobbs came from. The last child of David and Kathleen's was born in March 1924. He's registered as still living with his wife in Mornington, Victoria in 1924 and 1925. In the meantime, Edward Williamson filed for bankruptcy in Moona, Tasmania on the 13th of October 1925. In the Hobart Mercury, on the 26th of May 1926, an article titled "A Bigamy Charge, Defendant Committed for Sentence." John Edward Frank Williamson, a respectable-looking labourer, was presented before the police magistrate in the City Police Court yesterday on a charge of bigamy, to which he pled guilty. It was stated that the defendant had married Miriam Rose Ellie, but his former wife was still alive. Detective Fleming handed in a statement by the accused which disclosed that his wife had left him about 13 months ago for Melbourne, and as he had heard that she was bigamous when she married, he thought he was free to marry again. Now, however, he realised he was wrong in having done so, and he wished to plead guilty to the charge. The magistrate formally committed him to the Supreme Court for sentence, bail in one surety of £25 being allowed. He'd married Miriam Alley on the 10th of April 1926. Flora and David Hobbs had a child, William Charles Hobbs, known as Bill, on the 11th of November 1926 in Albert Park, Victoria. Flora named herself Florence May Williams on his birth certificate, and David listed himself as John David Hobbs. David stated he was born in Brisbane, Queensland. Flora said she was 29, she was in fact 35, and born in Tasmania. DNA has revealed that David Paul is not William's father. On the 13th of May 1930 in the Melbourne Age, sale of a car, man committed for trial. At Essendon Court yesterday, a charge of having, while a bailee, stolen a motor car was preferred against John David Munro, 41 years salesman of Audley Street, East Brunswick. Evidence was given by Robert Frank Williams, a garage proprietor of Footscray, that he sold a 6-cylinder sedan motor car for £110 on the 23rd of November to Munro, who was then living at Moonee Ponds. A credit of £6 paid in connection with another car was entered, and the balance to be paid weekly. Munro got into arrears, and when the witness tried to regain possession of the car, it couldn't be found. John Kirk, auctioneer and agent in North Essendon, said that Munro bought a car to him for sale by auction on the 12th of April. Timothy O'Connor, a dealer in North Melbourne, bought it for £21. When Munro applied on the same evening for the money, the witness said he must retain £13.03 as he'd ascertained that Mr Howell had advanced that amount on the security of the car. Munro said Mr Harrison of Ascot Vale was the former registered owner of the car, and the witness insisted on having a declaration of sale from him. A sworn declaration was produced the next day, and the balance of the money was paid to Munro. Robert Henderson JP said Munro called at his house in Essendon on the evening of the 12th of April and said he wished to make a sworn declaration that he'd sold a 6-cylinder sedan car to John Munro in August 1929. He explained that the car had been sold that day at auction and payment to Munro was being held back for the declaration. Munro signed the declaration, Michael J. Harrison. The accused, who denied the charge and reserved his defence, was committed for trial at the General Sessions on the 2nd of June. Bail was fixed in 2 sureties of £25 each. In the Tasmanian Advocate in Burnie on the 5th of June 1930, family starving, stole car to buy bread. Pleading guilty in the General Sessions today on a charge of larceny of a motor car as bailee, John David Munro, 41, of Moonee Ponds, a wood salesman, told Judge Foster that he'd sold the car when he was out of work. I did it because my wife and kiddies were starving. When I went home, the kiddies asked me if there was any bread. I did not intend to do anything dishonourable, and I am prepared to pay for the car as I'm now in work. Munro was released on a bond. So John David Hobbs is now calling himself John David Munro. However, he assumes John David Hobbs again by the end of 1930, so 6 months after he'd been to court. In the Melbourne Age on the 16th of December 1930, an irate debtor, substantial penalty for assault. At the Essendon Court yesterday, John David Hobbs of Essendon was charged with having assaulted John O'Loughlin. Evidence was given that when O'Loughlin called on Hobbs in connection to an account, Hobbs attacked him and knocked out some of his teeth. A fine of £5 on default or a month's imprisonment was imposed, with £5 5 shillings damages and £2 7 shillings and 6 pence costs. Then on the 13th of November 1931 in the Brunswick and Coburg Gazette at Moonee Ponds, alleged theft. At the Preston Court last week, John David Munro, labourer of West Brunswick, was charged with having stolen a fire stove and washing copper valued at £11, the property of the War Service Homes. Evidence was given by Robert Perry, an agent from High Street, Northcote, that the accused obtained the key of a house in Raglan Street to inspect it on the grounds that his wife might be agreeable to purchase it from the War Service Homes Commission. He did not return the key. The copper and stove were missed. Joseph Simpkin, second-hand dealer of Collingwood, said he purchased a copper on stand and a stove from the accused for £3 on the assurance that it was okay. The accused, who denied the charge and reserved his defence, was committed for trial. Bail was fixed at £100. And on the 17th of November 1931 in the Melbourne Age, man's sad story, stole to secure food. Bursting into tears, John David Munro of West Brunswick in the criminal court yesterday told Justice MacArthur that the reason he committed a theft was to secure money to obtain food for his wife and himself as they were both starving. He pled guilty to the charge of having at Preston on the 26th of October stolen a stove, copper and stand, the property of the War Service Homes Commission. I've been kicked out from place to place because I was out of work and could not pay my rent. I tried in every way to secure money and food. The Crown Prosecutor said the man was serving a sentence of 46 days for failing to pay the correct rate of wages determined by the Wages Board. Munro said, I bought a 2-horse lorry and was carting wood from the country to make a few shillings. I told a man who was out of work like myself that he could drive the lorry for 6 shillings a day while I supplied the wood. After a time, we had to let the lorry go. Then the other man put in a claim for me for not paying wages to him. He said he was not going on with the case, but he turned up the court and I did not. I did not have a chance to tell my story in the court. Justice MacArthur asked, how does he come to be an employer? And Munro said, I hired a double-horse vehicle to cart wood from the country and went into a kind of partnership with another man. Justice MacArthur said it looks like one of these cases where a man who is struggling and attempts to do something is punished for paying something less than the prescribed wage. That is the only gratitude he is shown. This is the thing that is happening over and over again. Munro said, they have now seized my furniture. Now everything is gone. The story of ingratitude so moved His Honour that he remanded the man in sentence and directed further particulars of his story to be obtained. So on the 1st of December 1931 in the Melbourne Argus, Mr Justice MacArthur passed sentence on John David Munro, aged 35, a labourer from West Brunswick, having pled guilty to a charge of having at Preston stolen a stove, copper and stand, the property of the War Service Homes Commission. Mr Justice MacArthur said that he was at first inclined to make a lenient view of the offence which Munro had committed, but when he had come to look into the matter, he found that it was not only a case of stealing. Munro had fraudulently persuaded the agent to allow him to go to the house under the pretence that Munro wanted to rent it. Munro was sentenced to imprisonment for 6 months. By 1936, David Hobbs's first wife, Kathleen, had remarried. She's referred to as Kathleen Haimbridge in a newspaper article. I cannot find a marriage certificate for her though, so the assumption was that she had not divorced when she remarried. Kathleen and John's youngest son, John Jr., and Florence's son, William Charles, were made wards of the state in Victoria and spent time in orphanages due to Florence not having the means to care for them, as John was in jail. They were released back into the care of Florence. When William enlisted in World War II, he stated that his name was William Charles Munro and his next of kin was his mother Florence Munro. On his marriage certificate in 1948, William stated his father was John Munro and his mother Florence May Butters, and William was working as a wood machinist. William was totally unaware he was born under the surname of Hobbs until the 1970s when he tried to apply for a passport. He then legally changed his name to Munro, as that was what he grew up assuming he was. His half-brother John was also known under the name of Munro. Florence and John had a daughter, Valerie May Noeline Hobbs, in 1927 in Victoria. However, she died on the 2nd of August 1929 from pneumonia and heart failure in South Melbourne. Her death certificate states that her father John is a wharf labourer. After 1931, John David Hobbs Poor / Munro disappears. In 1932, Florence is living in West Brunswick, and in 1937 and 1938 she was living in Carlton. If you can recall her death notice for her mother, Florence stated that she has a son-in-law, Fred, and she lists Bill as her grandson and also includes John as her son, and she's saying that she's at Warrenbane in Victoria in 1950.
The Frederick that is referred to, I would assume, is Frederick Eden White. He's a grazier that is from Warrenbane near Benalla, and they married in Carlton on the 5th of April 1952. On the marriage certificate, she states her name is Florence May Munro, that she's a widow, and she was widowed in 1932, and she was 49. She was in fact 61. Fred was 61 when they married. She also says that she has one surviving child, but doesn't mention her deceased daughter who died in 1929. She also lists her mother as Mabel Reeve, who is actually her older half-sister. Flora died on the 28th of June 1966 in Benalla, Victoria, aged 75. Her death record says that she's 62. There was an obituary in the paper, Mrs. Florence May White. The death took place at the Benalla Memorial Hospital on the 28th of June of Mrs. Florence May White of Thomas Street, Benalla. Aged 62, the deceased was a daughter of Robert and Martha Butters of Tasmania, where she was born. She came to Victoria 41 years ago and married in Melbourne, the first marriage to Mr. John Munro, who predeceased her. She leaves one son, William, of Melbourne, by the marriage. The second marriage took place in Melbourne 14 years ago to Mr. Frederick White of Warrenbane, who survives her. The funeral took place at the Methodist Church, and she was buried in the Benalla Cemetery, and her son, William Munro, was one of the coffin bearers. Interestingly, her death certificate states that she'd spent 40 years in Victoria, 18 years in Tasmania, and 4 years in New South Wales. I could find no evidence of her residing in New South Wales for 4 years of her life. As with all death certificates, it's difficult to really take them as 100% truth, and keeping in mind that her husband Frederick would have been the informant, and so he's based that purely on what she would have described and where she'd lived throughout her life before they married. So Flora definitely was an interesting lady to work out, with a lot of name changes and quite a few marriages, either formal or informal.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.